Anytime they mention the alt-right, for instance, they always make it sound like it's just a bunch of guys in the basements. They don't talk about how these guys have wives, and the wives are supportive, and the wives go to these meetups and conferences, and that they're there. So I think it's important for right-wing women to show themselves that actually we are here, you're wrong. I think it's good kind of to be spokeswomen for our movement and to kind of sell it a little bit. This is propaganda.
A passing glance at the alt-right can give the impression that it is very much a boys' club, and as many have pointed out, the white supremacists who attended the rally were mainly men. However, there were a couple of female faces in the crowds, standing in solidarity with men fighting against the Jewish communists and criminal that apparently run their town and are most likely funded by George Soros, who is, as you know, an actual vampire who survives off blood and cucks. Personally, I've been interested in women who are involved in the alt-right and other white supremacist far-right extremist type groups for quite a while, as they are definitely out there. In fact, they're some of the alt-right's most popular online figures. However, many people tend to overlook them when discussing far-right radicalization and the rise of the far-right.
Another painful aspect of mixing. I mean, people always fall in love. Of course, people are always going to race mix and fall in love. But what's happening now is we see a push for it, like it's the ideal.
This is understandable, as it's already quite difficult to find out the exact number of people involved in the alt-right, because the movement is rooted in the internet and is a collection of people with far-right ideologies that all embrace some form of white nationalism, along with the fact that women make up roughly 15 to 20% of the movement, which is a number cited by a lot of the academics who study far-right extremism. The general lack of discussion around this subject also has to do with the way we discuss white supremacy in general, as we tend to view it through a gendered lens. When thinking of a KKK member or a neo-Nazi, the last person that comes to mind is a woman. This same framing that erases Jewish and Muslim women and women of color from larger conversations surrounding racism and white supremacy also tends to erase white women who perpetuate white supremacy, and they go unnoticed. To ignore the full picture of those who are involved in the far right is to seriously underestimate its reach. Just like how ethnic nationalism crosses class lines, as most of the people involved in the Unite the Right rally were visibly upper middle class educated people, despite our tendency to view racism as something born out of poverty, it tends to cross gender lines as well. So in this video essay, I want to dissect the complex gender politics and involvement of women in the alt-right and other white supremacist movements that align with them. There is no denying the misogyny within the alt-right, as it runs rampant throughout the movement. This isn't surprising, as misogyny is a core tenet of white supremacy. The patriarchy and white supremacy are ideologies that are deeply intertwined. This is not to say that all misogynists who are pieces of shit are white supremacists who are worse pieces of shit. But all white supremacists are misogynistic. Despite the ideological divides within the far right, there are many ways to go about generating as much suffering within the world as humanly possible. The movement agree on several key points. 1. There are fundamental biological differences between men and women. 2. By design, men and women are not equal, but rather complementary. Men are the strong, rational warriors, risk-takers, and protectors of the white race, while women are yielding, emotional mothers, wives, and nurturers. 3. Traditional gender roles are natural, therefore just, and must aggressively be reinforced for the survival of the white race. This is one of the main reasons why those on the alt-right despise feminism. Feminism in their eyes is destroying the white race through abortions, race mixing, and allowing white women to exercise freedom and autonomy over their own bodies, which they view as a form of betrayal to white men. Men of the alt-right lament over their emasculation and see themselves as the defenders of white masculinity, which is under attack by SJWs and feminists. Of course, many of these people started out as anti-feminists and MRAs, which acted as the gateway drug into far-right extremism. The common theme of male camaraderie fueled by violence and toxic masculinity has deep roots in the history of fascism, along with the aggressive enforcement of traditional gender roles. So does the theme of sex and motherhood as a duty women owe, not only to their husbands, but to the people, the nation, the race, etc. Under white supremacy, and really all forms of ethno-nationalism, women become political objects to exert power and control over. Whenever fascists talk about their overwhelming desire to protect white women, what they really mean is that they want exclusive control and access to white women. This becomes clear when considering the fact that figures like Black Pigeon Speaks advocate for sexual consent to be completely abolished and that every woman should be assigned to every man. As much as these people hate communism, they love the idea of applying the concept to their genitals. Despite railing against Islamists and decrying Muslim men as the true rapists and misogynists, they admire the way men within Islamic fundamentalist communities, as the infamous fascist Norwegian serial killer Anders Breivik put, keep their women chaste.
Islam, on the other hand, keeps their women chaste.
Painful aspect of mixing. I mean, people always fall in love. Of course, people are always going to race mix and fall in love. But what's happening now is we see a push for it, like it's the ideal.
When it comes to miscegenation or race mixing, white women are policed much more harshly than white men. In fact, some alt-right men are pretty open about their fetishization of Asian women, which again is not surprising, as white supremacy is largely structured around maintaining the purity of white women. This protection does not extend to white queer women, trans women, disabled women, or any woman who falls outside of the category of worthy of protection. And those that fall into this category are idealized as the keeper of white racial purity, while simultaneously objectified as helpless pieces of property to be protected from black and brown menaces unleashed into their society from the hands of the Jews. Other contradictory views of white women include ethereal European goddesses and potential race traders. Much of the xenophobia around white supremacy is based around the black brute stereotype, branding black and brown men rapists who target white women. This has historically been used to justify lynchings committed by the Ku Klux Klan, and is used today in order to limit non-white immigration and more brutal policing in certain communities. To repeat what ContraPoint said in her video, which will be linked below, titled Alpha Males, this is why xenophobes place so much emphasis on the sexual danger non-white immigrants pose to white women, and the endless discussion of events that seemingly validate this fear. Despite this, people, especially women in the alt-right, attempt to defend their movement from charges of misogyny with, how can they hate women they love and protect? This defense is common whenever you attempt to charge far-right movements of hatred, as they are hate groups. However, their rhetoric often does not center their hatred of most of humanity, but love. They talk about their love for their women, children, race, culture, and nations. However, drawing on what PhilosophyTube stated in his video titled, Do Racists Just Love Their Country? This love is simply a form of branding, as an open white supremacist actively promoting genocide pushes away normal white people who may be casual racists, as explicit racism in society is generally regarded as unacceptable. When dissecting what white supremacists consider love, which they posit in the form of protection, it's actually a form of possession. They don't actually love white people, especially women, since it's clear that they don't hold a lot of them in high regard. What they love is the idea of whiteness, which is nebulous and unstable, as a concept that relies on the existence of the other in order to even exist. Which is why I posit that if white genocide were an actual thing, that white nationalists would be the ones spearheading it. Women in the alt-right are generally disappointed with the modern state of feminism and the feminist movement at large, believing that it has caused unhappiness for women because it ignores the biological differences between men and women that must be satisfied through gender roles, and that white nationalism has their true interest as a woman at heart. However, as journalist Stuart Darby pointed out in her report titled The Rise of the Valkyries, they also embody a glaring contradiction. By forwarding the agenda of the alt-right, they stand shoulder to shoulder with men who think that female independence has undermined Western civilization. The position that women should not even be allowed to vote is quite common within the movement, while claiming that white nationalism will provide true liberation for white women. Female commentators are attempting to paint over the movement's misogynist reputation, describing it as a refuge where white women can embrace their femininity and racial heritage without shame. The alt-right understands that women are not only important when considering numbers, but for civic legitimacy as they begin to creep out of the dark corners of the internet and into mainstream politics. Like any political movement that is deadly serious about achieving their goals, they understand that they cannot survive on men alone. As one female pundit recently wrote, the prospect of the alt-right attracting women terrifies the left, and it should, because they know that once the threshold of female involvement is reached, there's no going back. Despite having a rather loose relationship with reality, what Lana Laktef, one of the most prominent female members of the alt-right, said rings true.
When women get involved, a movement becomes a serious threat.
Like their male counterparts, these women reject what they regard as cultural Marxism poisoning Western society, including white genocide through consensual interracial relationships, feminism, and degeneracy, while putting a feminine spin on the movement's overwhelmingly patriarchal and xenophobic rhetoric by old-fashioned ideals of beauty and womanhood. To touch on the topic of feminism, women within the movement emphasize how the feminist movement, ranging from the first wave suffragettes, were mainly focused on expanding the rights of upper-class cis straight white women, including the right to vote, which many many on the alt-right view as the first step to the breakdown of the family and society as a whole, to third-wave feminism, which have brought forth concepts such as intersectionality, which they seem to hate even more. Despite the fact that a common criticism of feminism from those who are alt-right enablers or apologists being that it focuses on upper-class white women in the West, and that intersectionality is a way to combat that. The good old days where the man whose position was the breadwinner and head of the household, being supported by his dutiful wife whose life is dedicated to having and caring for children, disappeared. Far-right women emphasize the need to rebuild that type of large, tight-knit, heterosis-normative white families with conservative values. All of this entails and worships a natural hierarchy. However, it's embraced in the white nationalist worldview. If the white race is to continue to exist, women must accept their inherent inferiority to men as an absolute truth. Patriarchy is not only natural, normalized, but desirable and necessary. The inferior sex should be taken care of and protected by their men, a euphemism for complete subordination. Most women who join the alt-right enter the same way a lot of men do. General disillusionment, feeling alienated from society, and falling down an online rabbit hole of conspiracy theories that opened the floodgates for white supremacist or white nationalist rhetoric. Sometimes they are targeted by other women like Lana Lochtef, the co-host of white nationalist talk show Red Ice, who invites those who seem malleable enough to accept white nationalist dogma onto a radio show. An example of this is happening is Brie Fachot, who went from discussing novels on her YouTube to an #alt-right traditionalist after her appearance on Lochtef's radio show. In Fachot's case, it was her video railing against academia, racial diversity, and defending novels with all-white characters in full fury that piqued Lana's interest in her. A more troubling means of red-pilling females, however, is inciting fear through using the threat of rape at the hands of black and brown men, which again is a fairly common tactic in the white nationalist handbook. In fact, it's so popular that it's officially acceptable again to outright tar an entire race as the rapists, along with fabricating false rape statistics and linking it to immigration, rather than the definition of rape has expanded and the number of reported rapes have increased, which is a generally good thing, thanks to our proto-fascist white nationalist adjacent President Donald Trump, who I stress isn't a part of the alt-right, but rather a useful idiot who they are taking full advantage of to further push their agenda forward. Women in the alt-right work mostly behind the scenes and often of their own volition. This is most likely why we didn't see too many of them at the Unite the Right rally, as like Tara McCarthy, one of the most popular alt-right figures online, says. It's not the role of women to protect the borders, the nation, or the family, so we don't expect this of women, nor do we find it strange that they are less represented in something that we view as innately male occupation, guarding territory. Again, note the language of protection being used to frame attacks on others as protection of whites. Instead, women of the far right stick true to their rhetoric of Kinder, Kirche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, attempting to create an illusion of normalcy. There is a long legacy of white nationalists, identitarians, white supremacists, and, to be frank, fascists trying to create an illusion of normalcy. Kathleen Blee, a sociologist professor at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote in her book Inside Organized Racism that much about racist groups appears disturbingly ordinary, especially their evocation of community, family, social ties, and tradition. In a 2-year study of 34 women across the US, Blee found that her subjects, many of whom were educated and held good jobs, were responsible for socializing their children into racial and religious bigotry, often through the household and church, which is why many women on the far right support home or community or private schooling over public education, which they view as a leftist indoctrination site. Projecting this image of happy families and attractive, traditional young women supporting communities that are simply proud of their heritage that is not so different from your own community in order to sell fascism is their main goal. However, there are those such as Lauren Southern who works as a propagandist, creating content that indoctrinates those into all the alt-right. Lauren Southern in particular is someone who's extremely deceitful, which makes her even more insidious. This manipulation of the language and deception is a typical fascist strategy. In her Stockholm speech, Lana Lochtef herself points out this by stating, "Since we aren't physically intimidating, we can't get away with saying big things, big meaning extreme, profane, hateful, and outright disgusting." This is generally true considering the popularity of alt-right women online compared to men, which shows the women within the movement seemingly have an easier time amassing followers, in spite of regurgitating violent fascist rhetoric that most people would find appalling. Despite the success of those like Brittany Pettibone, Lauren Southern, Tara McCarthy, Rage After Storm, Lana Lochtef, Isla Stewart, and others like them benefiting the movement as a whole, there are disputes within the alt-right on the visibility of women within the type of leadership roles. On the one hand, a lot of men of the alt-right enjoy and encourage women to speak out and become leaders themselves. This is a pretty hollow position considering in the fact that they are fighting for a white ethno-state where women would not be involved within the sphere of politics. Instead, they would be confined to their home and perpetual baby makers. To forward the cause. On the other hand, you have sections that align with MGTOW, which wants to completely bar women from membership or at least severely limit their involvement. Often these types of men are the ones who attack women for being too outspoken, which leads them to simply accuse these women of being secret feminists in disguise, simply because of their visibility. They propose that the Lauren Southerns and Tara McCarthys of the world should be married and making white babies instead of being figures or aspiring leaders, which is a man's position in their eyes. In order to not incite violence or ire of more chauvinist members of an already extremely misogynistic movement, alt-right women must be visible in the right way. When they get behind their cameras and microphones, they have to prove that they are not a threat to their male counterparts through what they say and how they look, towing the line between a strong, determined white activist in their own right and a meek, docile girl in need of protection. The majority of well-known female alt-right personalities are generally young, attractive, agreeable women. Oftentimes, when they appear in far-right journals and online discussions, it is as objects of attraction, victims, or passive objects of male desire. Some people may be perplexed as to why women would want to join a movement that seeks to take away their fundamental rights and agency as human beings. White women have always been part of the white supremacist movements. Despite their positions as women, they are still white and thus benefit from white supremacy. Historically, white women have been enabled and afford racism even at the cost of misogyny, choosing to live in subordination to white men over solidarity with people of color. Though this isn't widely known, there were active female branches of the Ku Klux Klan that were considered better and more efficient at spreading white supremacy through the rhetoric surrounding immigration, interracial marriages, and desegregation, instead of engaging in direct violence. They encouraged it. The vast majority of Klanswomen wore robes, marched in parades, and participated in picnics, where a local lynching would be treated as a family outing. They were involved in advocating of eugenics and the fight for women's suffrage, arguing that only white women should get the right to vote. This took place in the rise of the Second Klan, founded by William Simmons in 1915, inspired by the release of the film The Birth of a Nation, and the rise of nativism, which was a response to an increase in immigration, which provided a space for the dark political ambitions of racist white women. Some have even risen to prominent roles. During the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, an Atlanta woman named Elizabeth Tyler spearheaded the creation of the group's National Propagation Department. She published a weekly newsletter writing advice on developing new chapters. Tyler told them to recruit friends, use churches as staging grounds, and to cast local minorities, blacks, Jews, Catholics, immigrants, as enemies. Legals were encouraged to study their territories, identify the sources of concern among native-born Protestant whites, and offer the Klan as a solution, Lee explains in her book, Women of the Klan. In less than a year of Tyler's association with the KKK, its membership expanded by 85,000. When she formed the dedicated women's wing in 1921, Tyler told the New York Times, "The Klan stands for the things women hold most dear." The wing attracted some 500,000 members over the next decade. Another one of her most important contributions was the galvanizing of the KKK's base by extending the list of targeted Klan enemies beyond black people, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and communists. The original Ku Klux Klan, created after the Civil War, had no official space for women until the 1920s. Instead, women were merely spectators, agitators, and false victims used as weapons to enact violence upon. As time moved forward, the Klan reblended from anti-black to a pro-white organization fighting for a stronger America. They also engaged in an increasing amount of terrorism, vigilante violence, while holding parades and picnics across the country. What was often the centerpieces of these picnics was a burned and charred black body swinging from a tree, sometimes surrounded by white women and their children, introducing them to the violent culture of white supremacy. Black men who were often falsely accused of raping white women and were lynched wasn't only a means of terrorizing blacks, but policing white women's behavior. African-American journalist, activist, and feminist Ida B. Wells found that black men accused of raping white women were often lynched without trial, which had the effect of fastening the odium upon them. The clearest example of this odium is the brutal kidnapping and killing of 14-year-old Emmett Till for supposedly whistling at Carolyn Bryant Donham, which she herself admitted was a lie several decades later. Moving from the 1920s America into 1930s Germany, Gertrude Schultz-Klink was described by Hitler as the perfect Nazi woman. Under Nazi rule, Schultz-Klink ran an organization that taught millions of women across the Reich how to be good Nazi wives, and eventually how to contribute to the war effort. The National Socialist movement sees the man and woman as equal bearers of Germany's future, she said in the 1936 speech, using language that the alt-right women today echo. It asks, however, for more than in the past, that each should first completely accomplish the tasks that are appropriate to his or her nature. She bore 7 children and proclaimed it necessary to make the calling to motherhood the way through which the German woman will see her calling to be the mother of the nation. The role of women in such movements have always been controversial. In these movements, women are both the future and the problem. Oftentimes, they face subjugation and abuse at the hands of men that claim to protect them. Men in the KKK grew threatened by Tyler's success, strength, and power that she was excommunicated in 1923. Schultz claimed to propose titles that women could hold in the Nazi Party, but male superiors ejected because the honorifics were too similar to men's. Women like Lana Lockteff often faced backlash from more misogynistic members of the movement. Often they must attempt to please two competing audiences: alt-right men who disregard women as tools to reach their goals, and women who are somewhat weary of a cause that will eventually sideline them. More intimidating challenges exist within the movements as well. In her interviews, Blee found that almost all the women she spoke with had difficulties in their personal lives caused by their activism, usually in their form of domestic violence and abuse. Many men indoctrinate women into the status. Former neo-Nazi and founder of Life After Hate, Christian Piccolini, stated in his interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! That it is an understatement to say that women in the alt-right are treated like trash. Instead, they are treated like garbage. Women exercising autonomy within their own right was naturally perceived as a threat within an ideology largely built around maintaining their subjugation as women. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and leave a response in the comments section below, as I enjoy hearing your thoughts and critiques, especially on complicated topics such as this. A lot of time, energy, and effort goes into these video essays, and it wouldn't be possible without my patrons listed below. If you wish to contribute to these videos, please check out my Patreon and donate if you can.